Welcome back, everyone. All right, let's just dive right into this. We're about to unpack a story that, well, you probably think you already know pretty well, right? But today, we're going to look at it through a completely different lens. In this explainer, we are taking a really deep dive into the profound academic and philosophical frameworks behind Malala Yousafzai's global impact. We aren't just doing a biography here or looking at the timeline of her life. Instead, we're actually exploring the mechanics of how a highly localized act of resistance magically transforms into a massive global movement for human rights and education. So if you're ready to understand the real architecture of global advocacy, you are definitely in the right place. Let's get started. It's a pretty massive question to kick things off with, isn't it? Can a single voice actually dismantle an armed extremist ideology? I mean, think about it. We have to ask ourselves how one young girl's story manages to scale from a deeply personal, really localized act of defiance in a remote valley all the way to becoming this global catalyst for international policy and peacebuilding. It's wild. But to really understand how that scaling happens, we first need to understand the environment that made that defiance necessary in the very first place. So let's set the stage. Section 1, the shadow of extremism in the Swat Valley. We need to establish the ground zero of this advocacy. Our source material points out a really stark, heartbreaking contrast here. The Swat Valley in Pakistan was historically celebrated for its vibrant cultural heritage and just breathtaking natural beauty. But then an escalating extremist influence started taking over. The Taliban Pakistan, or the TTT, rolled in and imposed this incredibly rigid, exclusionary ideology. And I want to be really clear based on what our sources tell us. The TTP's agenda wasn't just random chaos. They systematically dismantled established social norms, targeting girls' education, closing the schools, banning female teachers. That was a highly calculated strategy. It was specifically designed to maintain control, perpetuate subjugation, and just completely stifle any independent thought or future agency for the female population. Now, within this incredibly oppressive environment, getting an education took on an entirely new meaning. Because her father, Ziauddin, fostered a home environment filled with intellectual curiosity, Malala's early education wasn't just, standard academic instruction anymore. It became a conscious act of defiance. Simply waking up and choosing to learn was a direct rebellion against these encroaching forces of ignorance and repression. Moving on to Section 2, the voice of defiance and her early activism. Because you have to wonder, how do you actually fight back when everything around you is systematically being silenced? Just listen to the profound maturity in this quote. I mean, this wasn't written by some seasoned policy expert in Washington or Geneva. This was written by an 11-year-old girl. Under the pseudonym Gul Makai for a BBC blog, Malala found this clandestine, hidden platform. She managed to transform her own deeply personal fear and the raw emotion of watching her future literally being dismantled into this remarkably lucid articulation of the fundamental right to education. She made it crystal clear that denying education doesn't just hurt the individual, it hurts the entire stability of a society. Academically speaking, what we're witnessing right here is a textbook, yet totally extraordinary example of grassroots activism. It's all about leveraging whatever tools you happen to have available, which in her case was a digital blog, to challenge dominant narratives and spark meaningful dialogue. Just the simple act of bearing witness and writing her truth became a massively potent form of resistance. Her anonymous blog basically cracked the facade of normalcy that the extremists were trying so hard to project to the outside world. Which brings us to Section 3, global awakening and resilience to violence. Because as her voice grew, unfortunately, so did the danger, leading to a moment that literally shocked the entire world. The incredibly audacious assassination attempt on her school bus was, of course, intended to silence her forever and completely extinguish the movement for girls' education in the region, but it completely backfired. The source material explains how this act of extreme violence instead ignited a massive, undeniable wave of global solidarity. The outpouring of support transcended geographical, cultural, and political divides entirely. It essentially proved to the world that violence, no matter how brutal it is, simply cannot extinguish the pursuit of justice. If we track our timeline, it's a rapid and totally unprecedented evolution. She went from being a regional blogger to, tragically, a victim of extremist violence, to an enduring global symbol of resistance. Her survival against all those odds became a truly potent symbol of the indomitable human spirit. That attack wasn't the end of her story at all.
It was actually the pivotal turning point that amplified her message to an international audience with a level of urgency we rarely see.
Let's look at Section 4, the Malala Fund and global advocacy. So, what happens when you suddenly have the entire world's attention? Well, you institutionalize the change. You build a framework. Let's break down her transition into sustainable, long-term global policy work. This perfectly illustrates the engine behind her ongoing work. You see, the Malala Fund isn't just about charity. It's heavily rooted in some deep academic frameworks. Through the lens of development economics, we know that educating girls unlocks human potential and directly reduces poverty. Through gender studies, it actively dismantles patriarchal power structures and discriminatory norms. And then through the lens of peace building, education fosters the critical thinking and tolerance you absolutely need to mitigate the actual root drivers of conflict. So this isn't just a feel-good initiative. It's a highly sophisticated, multi-pronged approach to global progress. Operationally, how does this actually work on the ground? Well, the methodology is broken down into 3 main steps. First up is direct, decentralized funding to local activists, the people who actually know their communities best. Second, they engage in high-level global policy advocacy directly with governments. And third, utilizing her massive platform to continuously raise global awareness. Our sources highlight some really specific interventions this methodology enables, like setting up alternative learning spaces for girls in protracted conflict zones, or tackling major dropout factors like child marriage. Okay, Section 5, Human Rights and the Philosophical Basis of It All. Let's pull back for a second and look at this from the highest conceptual level. We need to connect her grassroots mission to universal laws. So the absolutely crucial point here is that Malala's advocacy does not exist in a vacuum. It is a direct, real-world translation of Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Think about your own life for a second. How does your proximity to free education shape your everyday reality? How does it shape your ability to just participate in a democratic society? Her fight basically champions the universal applicability of these exact rights, and it directly challenges any cultural justification that tries to limit them. At the philosophical core of her advocacy are these fundamental principles of human dignity and liberal humanism. Dignity is basically the intrinsic worth of every single human being. And the source text makes an incredibly powerful argument here. Denying education is not just a policy failure. It is a direct, targeted assault on human dignity. It deliberately limits a person's potential for self-realization and their individual autonomy. Therefore, demanding education is literally demanding social justice. What's truly remarkable about all of this is her methodology of response. Despite being a victim of extreme violence and provocation, her response has relentlessly been one of peaceful advocacy and persistent dialogue. The academic text actually draws direct parallels between her commitment to nonviolence and the teachings of historical figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. She proves the absolute efficacy of nonviolent resistance right here in the modern era. So to sort of summarize the incredible journey we've tracked in this explainer, we started by seeing how defying extremist subjugation in the Swat Valley naturally led to harnessing the raw power of narrative. That narrative, when it was met with violence, ended up catalyzing a global awakening. And rather than letting that momentum just fade away with the news cycle, it was brilliantly institutionalized through the Malala Fund to defend universal human dignity. Her journey definitively proves that age is absolutely no barrier to impactful leadership and that fundamental human rights transcend all geographical and political boundaries. I want to leave you with this final, truly provocative thought today. Knowing the sheer power of a single voice to challenge oppressive structures and ignite global change, how will you use your own voice? How will you step up to defend the inherent dignity of marginalized populations right in your own community? The framework is already there. The rest is entirely up to us. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep learning.